This video is about different types of forces. In my last video, we talked about two types of forces, gravity and the normal force, but this video is going to cover some other types of forces that you see in physics. First, let's start with the applied force. The applied force is a name that we give any force that's applied to an object, just a general name for a push or a pull. So an example might be pushing a couch. A spring force is any kind of force that comes from a spring that's been either compressed into a bound up position, ready to release some energy, or a stretched spring that's ready to collapse back in. So an example of this would be a Jack in the Box, or I thought of a good example. I used to do this all the time when I was in school. I would take these pins and they have I would take them apart and they have this spring inside here, and I would use that spring to just press down and then shoot the pin out. So that's an example of a spring force. A tension force is any force that is transmitted through a string, rope, cable, or wire when it's pulled tight by forces acting on opposite ends. So an example of this would be fishing, trying to pull up a fish with a fishing line, or even just a chandelier hanging from the ceiling. It's being supported by a rope or a cable, and so we call that a tension force. All right, let's look at another kind of force that you're familiar with already, and that is the frictional force. Now, there's more to the frictional force that we'll cover in a later video, but for now, the frictional force is the force that's exerted by a surface as an object moves across it or attempts to move across it. So pushing against a box that's firmly fixed on the floor here is going to result in some friction. So you're applying a force to the right, but friction is always opposing that motion that you're trying to have. So friction opposes the relative motion between two surfaces. Another example is, this happened to me pretty recently. So I took my daughter to a slide, and her shoes, she's not familiar with how to operate her legs in a slide. So whenever she's sliding down, her legs are against the slide, and her shoes are made of rubber, and they hit the sides of the slide, and it ends up slowing us down, and she has a lot of difficulty with that. Excuse me. So this is an example of a frictional force. It's opposing your sliding down. It's trying to stop you. Another example is golf. So if you've ever been golfing before, or mini golf, and you putt the ball and it's on its way, and somehow it stops just before getting to the hole, this is an example of friction, a type of friction called rolling friction. Objects are opposed, their motion is slowed down by rolling friction. Another one that you may not think of is just being able to hold on to something without it slipping. So if you're holding on to a drink here, gravity wants to pull that drink down, but it's stuck in your hand, and your hand is exerting a frictional force against the gravity force pulling it down. It's as long as it's stuck on your hand and not slipping, then that's a type of friction as well. All right, let's look at another type of force. This one you've probably heard of as well, and it's air resistance, also known as the drag force. So air resistance is actually a type of friction that acts upon objects as they travel through the air. In physics, we often neglect air resistance because of its negligible magnitude. It just basically is never really strong enough to affect our problems. And other times we just ignore it because it adds extra complexity to our problems. And so we keep things simple by ignoring air resistance. Air resistance is most noticeable for objects with high speeds or large surface areas. If it has a high speed, it's hitting a lot of air per second. If it's got a large surface area, it's running into more air per second. And so both of these examples here show that. If you're going really fast in a car and you stick your hand out the window, you notice the air resistance because there's a lot of air you're running into each second. A parachuter, when they open up their parachute, they're going to be collecting a lot of air, and so it has a high air resistance as well. Okay, and then two last forces here I wanted to look at is the electric force and the magnetic force. So for an electric force, it's the force that exists between electric charges. There are electric charges in all kinds of different objects. But for an electric force, a good example of this would be like the static electricity that comes from like the dryer, like a sock getting stuck to your shirt, or a balloon. So let me blow this one up. So for an electric force, if you rub a balloon against your hair, you can steal some electrons from your hair and put it on the balloon, and then you can stick that balloon to the wall, right? And so that's an example of electric force. It holds it together. And then a magnetic force, I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's a force that arises from the magnetic attraction or repulsion between two objects. So a magnet pulling on a paperclip is an example of that. So that's all I've got for you in this video. Remember, happiness is not having what you want, it's wanting what you have.